Good evening, everyone, and welcome to week one of the Rugby Research and Injury Prevention Group 2025 Journal Club. My name is Philip Tessick, and I'm a sophomore from the University of Michigan. I will be chairing the event this evening. We will begin our first Journal Club presentation with our first intern, Asha Gajraj, a freshman from the Columbia University. Asha will be presenting on the relationships between rugby players' tackle training attitudes and behavior and their match tackle attitudes and behavior. Asha, when you're ready, please share your screen.
Thank you so much, Philip. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I will be talking about a paper titled The Relationships Between Rugby Players' Tackle Training Attitudes and Behavior and Their Match Tackle Attitudes and Behavior, which is a 2015 study. So the background of this particular study, for some background information, when we look at behavior, we can see that it is impacted by multiple factors, such as self-efficacy or the ability to perform a skill, social influences, essentially the social atmosphere pertaining to athletes, and then the attitude of intention of the action or behavioral determinants. It has been found that tackle-related injuries consist of 61% of all injuries found in matches, and the questions that this study wanted to investigate were to study the attitudes and behaviors of players towards safety, and then understand the relationship between rugby skills and training, and then how they apply them to match behaviors. In other words, how does the training affect the mindset that the player has between training and when they actually perform for their games? So this was a survey administered in Cape Schools Week Rugby Festival, in which there were 10 schools involved, with 164 responses pulled from 9 of the 10 schools involved. The population was adolescent rugby players. And the survey essentially was a list of tackle-related questions that was refined in a three-step process with rugby coaches, investigators, and scientists. This was used to refine definitions and to reduce ambiguity when it came to answering these key questions. In the end, they came up with a 16-question survey, which contained Likert scales to standardize statistical analyses, and it investigated attitudinal and behavioral training questions versus questions pertaining to matches, essentially the difference between mindsets during training and then how that gets applied onto the field with the matches. And they investigated a slew of different parameters. However, a few key ones that came up in the results when a player was asked regarding using proper technique for improved performance, this was associated directly with preventing the ball carrier from retaining possession and preventing the ball carrier team from retaining possession in match play. Essentially, by they associated improved performance with how they performed in the game, specifically in ensuring that their team was able to control the ball at all times in order to get the most points. And we can see by the p-values that this is statistically accurate and relevant. The second results that stood out was the importance training tackling for injury prevention, and this was significantly associated with doing what is practiced in match play, and it is positively associated with own safety. Essentially, training tackling techniques that are done in training are applied into match play, and this correlates positively with a player's ability to try to play in order to reduce their risk of injury. Front-on tackles were executed most frequently in training, and this was expressed onto the field with 69% of front-on tackles being utilized. Essentially, there's a correlation between what is practiced in training sessions and then how that is applied directly into matches. And just to get a numerical holistic analysis over the results that were obtained, this is regarding social norms. So identifying a problem in the player's personal tackle technique and fixing it. As we can see here, when it comes to identifying an individual player, it is statistically relevant with going for the ball only, among other factors. However, when a player was asked how they associated identifying a team problem and tackle technique and fixing it, we can see with the p-values below 0.05 in value that this is positively associated with doing what is practiced, the proper technique, specifically own safety, and going for the ball only and staying on your feet. Essentially, when coaches address teams as a whole compared to when they are being corrected individually, it seems to be that there's more positive correlation, and this is seen by the greater chi-squared values. Essentially, what this shows is that players associate proper technique and training to denying the opposition possession of the ball, therefore increasing match play. And then the importance of tackle training to prevent injury and time spent on the technique to prevent injuries was positively associated with behaviors that did reduce the risk of injury in matches. There was a moderate association between the type of tackle coach during training and type of tackle in matches, and essentially, this was showed with the front on tackle being the most relevant. There was also a relationship between the type of tackle coach during training. And this suggests that for a few aspects in tackle training, coaches are meeting match need as there is a correlation between what is covered during training, additionally, what the player is encountering during their matches. There's also a difference in match behavior association between fixing a single player's tackle technique problem and then fixing it on comparison to a team as a whole. And for this study mentioned that they had to consider social aspects. Essentially, when correcting individual players, they may have a fear of judgment, and when they're just together as a team, they may feel more of a community and thus more willing and more have a positive association to doing what is taught to them. So for limitations and future studies, while this was a large sample size with over 75% of a response rate, not all questionnaires were completed in examination conditions with the investigator present, and with most NL surveys, there is a level of subjectivity as due to the nature of the survey. So that could have possibly changed the results ever so slightly. Also, the sample size consisted of adolescent rugby players, and so conducting the same survey among a broader age range and area as this was only surveyed in South Africa. In conclusion, this study was the first study to report on the relationships between players' training and match attitudes and behaviors for tackling, specifically in rugby union. And overall, there was a positive finding with coach training and match performance. Essentially, the coaches were meeting the needs of the players, and that translated positively to the field. There was tackle training to prevent injury, and this increase in the injury mindset when it came to tackle training could positively increase player performance in the future. And match behaviors, doing what is practiced and proper technique and own safety, and staying on feet were consistently associated with instruction and demonstration, suggesting that these coaching methods may be effective for training in these contact skills. This is my reference. And are there any questions?
Thank you, Asha, for that great presentation, and I'd like to open the floor to any questions. Any of you guys want to take the time to think of a question? I actually have a question for Asha. Did the or you can go ahead, Dr. Lopez.
No, it's no big deal. What I want to tell you guys, and this is something very unique, is that when you're looking at these cohorts, particularly of rugby playing cohorts, I think what happens is you need to consider when they do these studies, Dr. Brown, Sharif Hendricks in South Africa, they usually go to these large tournaments, but these tournaments are uh, again, nobody's really certain how they're conducted, how structured they are, how loosely, the teams are. So we don't know really what kind of parameters. I think that's why when they said in the conclusions there, Asha, they said, weren't under the exact observation or the investigator to see them complete
Yes.
the surveys. The big issue there is, again, um, we've tried to apply this when we get our nutrition data. We make sure that we stand there. We make sure that whoever fills it out the best possible. We understand that they're in between matches and that, we almost got to be there to make sure. So if they give them these surveys, we don't know who's filled them out for them. Once they leave the venue, it gets a little tricky. I'm not saying that occurred with Dr. Hendricks and his team. I'm just saying that when you're at these community events, it's always very challenging, let alone if they don't understand the questioning, if they don't have um, the age range. I'm sorry, Asha, but this
I mentioned it was adolescent rugby players.
did they really understand the questions that were being proposed? If you go to that table that they suggested, it's always hard. I think the biggest problem with our IRBs here in the United States is that they make sure that the verbiage, Lily knows, she knows that the verbiage has to be brought down for an adolescent to understand. Obviously, Dr. Coe here versus Dr. Dawson's knowledge base is very different. So the importance is, are the questions being proposed appropriately to Dr. Coe versus Dr. Dawson? And this is an important aspect when you put these studies together. And that's why I think when we put together most of our surveys, I think they went through at least 10 to 12 rounds of edits just to get surveys appropriate, uh, that they felt comfortable that the surveys could be asked. So these are all important things when you go through an IRB review. Even for our RRI's reporting system, they had to make sure that they're going to be universally applied. And this is why we've tried to standardize that early on. But again, I was very fortunate to see or know about that early on. So again, I think they did this one study, but I don't think they did it or followed up anywhere else. I think it was very questioned about how the cohort of adolescents analyzed or understood the questioning about it. So if you go to those tables, Asha, if you don't mind, the table that asks the questions, right? How do we know? Um, obviously, our group is a little bright, so we can understand, safety of the ball carrier versus safety of the tackler. But do all adolescents understand that? This is a question, safety of both you and the ball carrier. Um, you know, I don't know. Even in university, um, did I really recognize whether or not I kept both feet on the ground? Staying on your feet. It's very dynamic when you're playing. This is why video footage is so very important. Analyzing, collisions, analyzing anything, tackles, to really, really hone down on the messaging. But anyway, I just wanted to bring that point up that it's always a challenge asking these questions of adolescents. So it's always a big issue.
Yeah, and on that note of limitations, my question was very similar, but if I may also add in, did the study mention how the questions were structured in order um, to reduce the chances of survey bias or potentially leading people to certain answers as the survey goes on?
In the methodology, they did mention that the questions went through multiple rounds of editing between coaches, scientists, and the actual investigators. What I also found was that when they structure their particular survey, they had different elements when it came to different questions. So, for example, if you look back to the results, it would have a one identifier. So, example, identifying a problem in your tackle technique and fixing it. And then using the Likert scale that they mentioned in the methodology, they would rank which one was most with the most correlation to them. And so I guess in that way that reduces outside bias by having them rely solely on what they think their association is when they hear this particular term.
Very nice. And if there are no more questions, I think that will conclude Asha's presentation as we move into our next presentation here. Our second presentation will be from Lucy Dawson, a recent graduate of Howard Medical School. She will be presenting on tackle technique of rugby union players during head impact tackles compared to injury-free tackles. Lucy, when you're ready, please take it away.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'm just trying to set up my notes. Okay. So thank you for the introduction. I'm Dr. Lucy Dawson, and I'll be presenting on a paper titled Tackle Technique of Rugby Union Players During Head Impact Tackles Compared to Injury-Free Tackles. So a bit of background for this study. Rugby has an above average risk of injury compared to other sports due to the high frequency of contact that happens. And head injuries have an incidence of 0.6 and 0.8 injuries per 1,000 exposure hours for ball carriers and tacklers, respectively. Um, there's a correlation between technical proficiency and concussion-free tackles that has been observed in previous studies. However, some of those previous studies have been limited by a very low sample size and focusing solely on the tackler and not the ball carriers. The goal of this particular study was to compare technical proficiency during head-impacted tackles to proficiency during successfully made safe tackles. And the ultimate goal is to influence player and coach education to prevent head impacts and therefore concussions. The methods. This study used New Zealand and South African rugby union video databases. They identified the role of the player who had their head impacted and the type of tackle. So they split it into a front-on tackle and a side-on tackle. And the sample size was 156 for the head impacted tackles. And what's unique and good about the study is that they matched the footage to injury-free successful tackles. And so for those, they had 170 tackles in that category. The videos were analyzed using a software called Sports Code, the elite version. And to measure proficiency, they assessed it using a standardized technical criteria that had been established in previous studies. And that splits the contact into pre-contact, contact, and post-contact phases. So this is very busy, but I just put this up here to show kind of some of the things that they were looking for. So when they went through to code the videos, they looked at, as I said, the pre-contact, contact, and post-contact phases of the tackle. And within each of those phases, like specific criteria, such as eyes focused on the tackler or bending into contact or leg drive upon contact. And each video, or for each criteria, they got a 0 or a 1 based on if that action was done or not. And so in this table, you can see that for all of the tackles in this category, they gave a mean average of if this particular criteria was met or not. You get the mean and the confidence interval for that mean. And then on the right 3 columns, you can see they compared different values. So head impacted versus head impacting player. So that's the person who's getting their head hit and the person who's hitting the other person in the head. And this is kind of the meat of this, like the results right here, where it compares for front-on tackles and for side-on tackles, kind of the technical proficiency of the players based on those criteria that you saw in the previous table. So you can see that for comparing the successful tackles and the head impacted tackles, that there is a statistically significant decrease in the technical proficiency of the players. You can see the gray bars are the successful tackles, and consistently for front on tackles, side on tackles, no matter if it was the ball carrier or the tackler that was getting head impacted or impacting, their technical proficiency was less than that of the tackle. And all this data, let's see, the data was reported within a 95% confidence interval. They use a two-tailed p-value for all tests with a p less than 0.05. And they did separate analyses for front-on versus side. So the discussion, this study builds on previous video analysis work on concussions and head impacts. And it supports the theory that when there is a head injury, there is a technical deficiency. But the unique thing, as I said, is that this study looks at both the tackler and the ball carrier. And so it looks at both players in the tackle, and it shows that it's equally important that the tackler and the ball carrier have technical proficiency to decrease the incidents of head contact. And it highlights the relative importance of tacklers' actions in reducing head impact tacklers. Comparing head impact tackles to successful ones also helped the authors identify specific technical deficiencies for both players in the tackles. Like if you remember back from this, they were able to use this stratification to highlight which specific actions are more consistently deficient in the tackler or the ball carrier in these tackles where there is head contact. So for example, a couple of things that they noticed that the head impacted ball carriers were deficient in was body positioning, explosiveness upon contact, leg drive after contact. And for the head impacting players, they noted that they were deficient in skills such as, not skills, but in the moment of the tackle and head positioning, shortening steps before contact, head placement, and arm usage during contact. And the takeaways from this study, the information gathered can be used to inform coaches and trainers on specific techniques to emphasize in training to reduce head impact, such as the skills I mentioned on the last page. And it emphasizes specifically that both the ball carrier and the tackler are responsible for each other's safeties, and that it's important to practice these skills cooperatively and not in isolation. I think a lot of times in rugby training, there are contact and non-contact drills that isolate and just focus on, your one skill as a tackler or another skill as the ball carrier. But this study highlights the importance of actually having a tackle and having those players learn how to tackle and be tackled in a cooperative manner. And here are the references that I used for this presentation. Any questions?
Thank you for that great presentation, Dr. Dawson. If there are any questions, feel free to open the floor. And if there are no questions from the interns, Dr. Lopez, feel free to add whatever.
Did they use Gabriel Wright, did they use the consensus statement on the video analysis to do this study?
Yeah, here it said they use actually, I was looking at what they use to test the reliability, but I don't know about the consensus statement. I know they use the intra-class correlation coefficient to make sure that what the videos they analyzed were accurate. But I'm going to go back and
Right,
check.
the kappa coefficient in between graders. But did they apply the consensus statement in their methodology? Do you know this, Dr. Dawson, or no?
That doesn't sound familiar from looking through, but I have it pulled up.
What year was this?
2018.
So it might have been before they put together the video analysis.
It says something on page 2, on a paragraph that starts for general injury. In the middle, it says this study was restricted to analyzing head impacts that are medically diagnosed as a concussion. Oh no, but that was just
No, that was talking about
yeah.
I think that was talking about another study that focused only on tackles that resulted in a concussion, whereas this is just on head impact, not specifically for concussion.
So what we're talking about here, Dr. Dawson, do you know what we're talking about, the consensus statement? And Gabe, why don't you elaborate on it if she does not?
No, I don't.
So Dr. Dawson, there was another article I'll share it with you afterwards where they basically made like a rules or like general guidelines on how to analyze videos. So if they didn't use these guidelines, it might affect the reliability of the study if they didn't use the established guidelines.
Okay. Yeah, I just did a quick word search, and they talk about the consensus statement, but it's in talking about another study.
That's the concussion consensus statement.
Oh, yes. Okay, you're right.
The concussion consensus statement is different than the video analysis consensus statement.
I see.
So over the past 6, 7 years, 8 years, they're putting together guidelines, right? Obviously, a big problem, we'll say, Dr. Dawson, is that the 4 or 5 major papers that have come out on rugby in the United States, not by our group, have all used varying methodologies. That limits inter-study comparability.
Right.
Right? So therefore, we can't compare apples to apples, right? If the Ohio paper is going to look at it by athletic exposures, to American football to rugby, or if the West Point paper is going to be looking at, injuries, but they're going to add 7s and 15s conjointly. You can't do that, right? You can't just start mixing cohorts of formats, right? Sevens is way different than 15s. So the consensus statements, when they put them out, whether it's concussion, whether it's the IOC consensus statement on injury and illness, these are definitions clearly to set the standard of how you should collect data, analyze it. If you want to be taken seriously, BJSF one on the top, BJSF up.
Oh, this one. Yeah. So this was after the study came out.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's part of the same group. So they, refined what they were going to be doing in their analytics. So that's really kind of where we're at. Obviously, they changed it. What would have been nice is that if you were taking that one step further, discuss the consensus statement and said what were the difference between this analysis and what they include in the consensus statement. So that's all it is. Anyway, on that note, they set the consensus statement together now, and they're suggesting on how to analyze videography of injuries in sport and rugby. But you can just imagine that can be applied to every contact and collision sport. Once you have the foundation of a consensus statement of this nature, then it can contribute, etc., to the overall better science that's produced or published. Okay?
And
Any
if there are no,
questions? Go ahead.
if there are any questions, feel free to unmute and ask. And if there are no more questions, we are going to move on to our next presentation. Next presentation will be by Rithvik Panuganti, a rising senior at Georgia Tech, and he'll be speaking on mechanisms and factors associated with tackle-related injuries in South African youth rugby union players. Rithvik, when you're ready, take it away.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My presentation today will be the mechanisms and factors associated with tackle-related injuries in South African youth rugby union players. It is a study from 2016 in the American Journal of Sports Medicine. So just a quick background. So most of the rugby union injuries occur during tackles, and the causes are well studied in seniors, but the focus of the study is in the youth, which is less understood due to limited research in this field. And the two primary methods that the researchers use to analyze the tackle injuries is through injury records and video footage from youth matches to identify environmental and mechanical factors that are linked to injury risk. So this study is pretty unique because it uses video analysis, which is the closest that you can get to a firsthand view of these injuries. And it's used in the senior population, but it's less used in the youth rugby to assess risk factors. So that's where this study comes in and analyzes that. So just a little bit more on youth rugby itself. So the youth rugby union carries a high injury incidence with about like 49.5 injuries per 1,000 player hours, which was reported in South African under 18 players. And once again, while most research has focused on senior players, youth level data remains limited, particularly regarding tackle related injury mechanisms. And in youth matches, it's tackles that account for the majority of injuries, and they often involve the head and neck region in the tacklers and the lower limbs in the ball carriers. And another aspect that this study touches on is that fatigue, poor technique, and limited awareness of the impending contact were identified as key factors contributing to injury risk in youth players. So just a little bit on the methods. This injury surveillance was conducted at the South African Rugby Union under 18, the Craven Week youth rugby tournaments from the years 2011 to 2013. So over 3 years, this data was collected, and the numbers are 1,320 players and 89 matches. And one point to note is the high match load. This is a tournament style rugby competition. So there's three matches per player within 1 week. So that keep that in mind when factoring into fatigue and poor technique. There's a higher load during this type of tournament. And there were 84 tackle-related injuries that were recorded, and 49 of those had usable video for analysis. So just keep that number in mind because it alludes to one of the limitations of the study in terms of how much was usable as video analysis. And surveillance was followed using the international consensus injury reporting standards. And the two ways that this study identified injury was first was a medical attention injury, which required silent assessment only with the medical staff and corresponding people there. And the other version was a time loss injury where they missed more than one match or day of activity in the tournament. And another important point to note is that each tackle coded for match situational variables in terms of like the quarter of the match, like which helps talk about like the fatigue in terms of which quarter the match the injury is recorded, and pre-contact, such as ball carrier awareness, and then contact injuries in terms of body part contacted and the tackle type, and then also post-contact where which body part was the first to hit the ground. So the results, I broke it up in two parts. One is like the ball carrier injury results. So first, like the match situational. So injury risk was significantly higher in the third and fourth quarters, which makes sense because this is where there's higher fatigue. And as there's more fatigue, the technique in these youth players goes down and it results in more injuries. So as you can see in the values, the 9.75 is a relative risk ratio. So basically that's saying that in the third quarter, it's 9.75 times more likely for an injury in that quarter compared to the first quarter, which was used as a reference. And for pre-contact, that's just telling you about the awareness of impending contact to reduce injury risk. So basically, it's 80% less likely to get injured if you have some awareness of the contact that is coming towards you. And then also regarding the contact with a tackler's shoulder and arm reduced injury risk, and also a moderate fend also reduced injury risk when the ball carrier was fending off the tackler. And in terms of tackler injury results, so injury risk was significantly higher in the fourth quarter, and there were no pre-contact variables that were significantly associated with the tackler injury risk. And contact-wise, injury risk was lower with same side shoulder tackles, which is basically if you're running and you lead in with your right shoulder, you also have your right leg forward. So that is what makes up a same side shoulder tackle. And also bringing the ball carrier's legs to the ground reduced the risk of injury in the contact phase. So some limitations that about the study is only 49 injury events had usable video, and there were 84 total tackle injuries. So that is one limitation, that not all of them were able to be analyzed using the video footage. And another thing is the setting of the tournament. These findings are limited to only one elite youth tournament, which conducts in South Africa. And region by region, play styles can vary. Tackling techniques that are taught can vary. So this alludes into the generalizability of this. Is you should keep in mind before applying it to all schools or all tournaments based on the region and like all rugby play around the world. And also in the future, like other sports that involve tackling, like American football. And some, like I said earlier, the video limitations where there's poor quality or incomplete footage that excluded around 40% of cases. And another thing is that environmental variables, not everything was measured in terms of like the weather in the area and like if it was slippery that day or other conditions. And so for the discussion, one big takeaway is that injury risk increases late in matches, and most of the injuries occurred in third and fourth quarters. And this is likely due to fatigue from repeated contact and match load. And like I mentioned earlier, this Craven Week format is 3 matches per week, which significantly adds more load to players, and in terms of mental load and physical load, in terms of technique and how the youth are playing the game. And as one thing that can mitigate this is rest, recovery, and conditioning are needed to reduce fatigue-related injuries. For example, if the athletes are used to more high-intensity training and train multiple days of the week, then they will be more used to the game conditions in terms of how much they're playing, and also just proper recovery methods that their coaches tell them about and conduct in their recovery and practice. So once again, like a big thing is that technique affects injury risk. So ball carriers were safer when they were aware of the contact and used the fend to block off the tackler. And head and neck contact increased injury for both tacklers and ball carriers. And tacklers were safer using same side shoulder tackles and when bringing legs to the ground, which is a technique that many sports the coaches tell their athletes to use. And also proper body position and technique are key for injury prevention. And just one quick thing about the ball carriers being aware of contact. One way they measured it was with peripheral vision. If the tackler was in the ball carrier's peripheral vision, then the injury risk went down in terms of them being aware of the contact. And some prevention and training implications is teaching and reinforcing safe tackle and ball carrying technique, especially under fatigue. That is what will help these athletes reduce injury risk. And using these findings to guide injury prevention programs and coaching strategies. And also, coaches and medical staff should work together to manage injury risk. And continued data collection and video analysis will help improve safety. Because like when the researchers are taking a look at the video analysis, they can conduct multiple studies on that. There's so many different aspects that they can watch in that footage and take note of compared to just looking at data or just surveying the athletes. This is just a reference, the article that I used. And yeah, thank you all for listening to the presentation.
With that, we'd like to open the floor to any questions. If you would like to ask anything, please unmute and ask.
So I think they talked about the limitations about capturing this data from a particular event, an elite tournament. So when you have these elite tournaments, we have them as well, and under the youth and high school division, and some are run better than others. I think as players, even Dr. Dawson comment, some tournaments when you go to them, they're just run more efficiently. We can see, even with Lily when we did the New York Sevens tournament, even the medical care is more efficient if there are people who are rugby based. They know what to expect. That's why we were very lucky that we saw the pathology we did, and no one died that day. It's an important thing, and everyone was cared for the best we could. On that point, like I said, capturing data from these particular tournaments, and this is one of our strengths, is that we collect data from all types of tournaments. The variability in our data set makes our data set stronger. So we collect data from whatever, Little Rock, Arkansas, all the way up to, Seattle, even the border there, Ferndale, like the tournament that's at the border of Canada. Allowing us to do that just validates the data more so. When you capture data, so say in theory, we've only captured data at the Rockaway tournament, right, Asha? Right, we covered it at the Rockaway tournament. We just collected data from that one tournament. It would take many more years to validate that data than if we captured the data from Rockaway, Hartford, New Haven. You know what I mean? Because of the variability of the data. So, as they said, the generalizability therefore is limited. You cannot say this applies to school, recreation, or other sports. And I'm glad that Dr. Brown and his group, make sure they emphasize that, because it's limiting when you do these kind of studies. Okay. Easy. On that note, are there any questions about that? So the limitations also, 40% of the data, the video, poor quality footage excluded, on average about 40% of the cases. Yeah, so it's challenging to when you try to do this data collection and videography collection. So that's what you need to keep in mind here, that they applied both methodologies on this one study. Am I correct on this?
Yes, Dr. Lopez. They used data collection and they used videography in their analysis.
Yeah. Did they actually state that they validated the reporting with the videography, or did the videography validate the reporting system?
Uh, that I would have to look
No
into
problem.
that.
No worries,
Yeah,
son. What it is that if that phrasing doesn't stick out to you, that's really kind of what they say.
gotcha. I think what they primarily used the videography in like they went in and analyzed the videography by itself as well, and
Independently.
yeah, independently.
So there is the one study that they looked at with the videography and the amount of injuries, and they actually validated the reporting or yeah, they validated the reporting system with videography. And that's kind of what we did with our under 19 paper. So there's different ways of stratifying the support or the validity of the data. And that's what you guys need to keep in mind when you're looking and reviewing these papers. Okay? Good job. All right, everyone. Let's proceed.
And with that, I'd like to thank all of our interns who presented for their great presentations, and that will conclude week one of the Rugby Research and Injury Prevention Group Journal Club. Thank you all for attending.